Hello, I'm Rob Satloff, the Siegel Executive Director of the Washington Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this very special event. The Middle East produces headlines every day. Every day, it seems like there's a new news story in some corner of that volatile region. But today, we're taking a step back because today we are celebrating a big event, a big intellectual event. We at the Institute produce analyses and policy notes and policy watches and briefings almost 4 days, 5 days a week. But it's not every day that we produce this, a substantial, intellectual, monumental work by our William Davidson Distinguished Fellow and Counselor to the Washington Institute, Ambassador Dennis Ross. I'm really delighted that we have Dennis at the Institute. Dennis is a throwback to the era when you could work for Republicans, work for Democrats, and essentially work to advance the national interest. There are very few people in public life in America who have Dennis's background, Dennis's CV, Dennis's accomplishments over more than 40 years of public service. It's a real honor and a pleasure for us at the Institute to have Dennis with us and to be supportive in helping Dennis publish Statecraft 2.0, What America Needs to Lead in a Multipolar World. Go to Amazon, get it now, get it early. It makes a great spring and summer reading as you're sitting on the beach enjoying a margarita or whatever it is you like. Today, we are announcing the release of this book, and we have a very special event. Joining Dennis today is Thomas E. Donilon. Tom Donilon, former National Security Advisor in the Obama administration. We're delighted that Tom is with us. Tom is a longtime friend of the Washington Institute. And most importantly for me, Tom hails from my home state of Rhode Island. Delighted, really, that you could join us today, Tom. And to orchestrate today's discussion, I'm especially pleased to have Susan B. Glasser, Susan of the New Yorker. Thank you very much, Susan. I'm sure many of our viewers follow your weekly essays on the ups and downs of politics and policy here in the Capitol, and delighted that you could be with us today. So today, Susan is going to have a conversation with Dennis and Tom about statecraft, what it means and how to apply it in the 21st century. If you'd like to get into our conversation, if you'd like to try to get your questions posed by Susan in our discussion, please send them by email to policyforum, one word, policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. They will come up on Susan's laptop, and we'll try to get them into this conversation. With that, it's a real pleasure to turn it over to Susan Glasser.
Rob, thank you so very much. We are all delighted to be here, and I must commend you for excellent book flackery. It's an important job. We do it in part to spare Dennis the burden of doing it all himself. So I will join in on that. This book, Statecraft 2.0, is another reminder that Dennis, in addition to the long and distinguished resume that you went over a bit of, is also a really accomplished author. And what he does so skillfully in this book and in his previous books, which I have relied on in my own work, is to marry his own deep experience and present not only case studies, but really some really excellent and perfect examples from his own interactions with American leaders, with world leaders over the last few decades. So it's a terrific and timely book, and I'm delighted to flack for it as well. That's Statecraft 2.0. Tom, also in the cause here, and also a character in the book. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those case studies, Dennis. I should mention a programming note. You can also put your questions in the Zoom question queue if you are tuning in today on Zoom, and we will try to get to those. Dennis, congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks for being here.
No, it's terrific. It's terrific to be with you in person. But I feel like, you know, we're living in a world where even writing a book based on your decades of experience, that the news cycle is moving so quickly. You know, it might be that you need to release Statecraft 3.0 by next week. But, you know, the world that we're living in, let's go ahead and start off a little bit with this moment, because I feel like it's always best to get the elephant in the room, so to speak, out of the way, especially because these terms of statecraft and strategery, they can seem really at odds with, I think, the profound disruption that we're experiencing right now. So I'm actually going to start out with just a very simple question for both you and Tom, which is, in your State Department counselor, national security advisor hats, you know, if you had to send a report back to your government about what was happening here in Washington right now, what's the pithy summary of what we're seeing in terms of the disruption in American foreign policy just over the last couple of weeks? How would you even, what's the name you would give for what's happening to us right now?
Well, I think you use the word. It's disruption. I think President Trump has come in determined, A, to learn the lessons from his first term, where he felt more constrained by people who were working for him. He didn't have this kind of control of, in a sense, all the branches of government. He is determined to demonstrate that he is changing things in a fundamental way. He is determined to show that he's putting America first. By the way, one of the things I note in the book in terms of going through traditions, he does embody one of our traditions that certainly dominated the US for its first century, which was unilateralism, not isolationism. Unilateralism tied to a kind of freedom of action, not being constrained, doing whatever is what he defines as being in our interests. This is what he is doing right now. The question for me that I would be writing about if I were talking to others would be to say, okay, we see what he's starting off to do. We've seen also sometimes he makes statements. I talk a lot about framing issues, where you frame issues in a way designed to get others to be responsive to you, to support you, to embrace what you're doing. He oftentimes frames issues for their shock effect, and he ties it to something else that is part of statecraft, which is leverage. And by creating the shock and the leverage, he tries to produce certain kinds of outcomes. The question I would have is, will these produce the outcomes that he seeks, or does he do the shock effect, not necessarily to produce an immediate outcome, but to create a response that he can then say, okay, I changed their behavior. I'll give one example of that. The relocation of Gazans. Did he really expect that 2 million people were going to be able to leave and there would be others who would take them? Or was he doing it to put the Arabs in a position where, okay, you don't like what I'm offering? Come up with an alternative, but it has to be practical, can't be slogans. We know the Egyptians have come up with a plan. I think it has some elements that are good, some elements that fall short. But now we'll see an interesting test to the administration, an interesting test of its statecraft. Will they go back to the Egyptians and engage in a process of discussion? The spokesperson for the White House said they didn't necessarily embrace what was being done, but we're going to keep talking. All right, that will be an interesting measure of, does his use of the shock effect change others to at least engage and change their behavior in a way that they wouldn't have otherwise?
So, Tom, give me your report from the active scene of the disruption.
Yeah, okay, a couple of things. First of all, about Dennis's book, just for 1 minute. Dennis and I, you mentioned, Rob, that Dennis worked for both Republican presidents, Democratic presidents, right, over the years. I first met Dennis and we began working on projects together in 1993, when Dennis agreed to stay on into the Clinton administration at the State Department to handle the Middle East account. So we worked together a long time, and it's been one of the great joys of my professional life. The book, I can just say a couple things about the book.
Absolutely, yeah. And we'll get into the
book. This is why I love the book. One is it is full of insights, right? I mean, you get more kind of insight per paragraph than the average international relations and foreign policy book. Point one. Point two is history, right? As Dennis knows, I firmly believe that history is absolutely key. Understanding history is absolutely key to effective foreign policy making and having effective interactions with your interlocutors around the world. We have a phrase, obviously, in the United States, the let's history. Well, that's not the way the world works, right? It's just not history, right? It is alive. It's critical. It really makes you a better policymaker, and we don't do enough of it. And I'm actually, there's another panel we could do. I'm concerned about the lack of study of history in our secondary education and college education systems.
Here, here.
The third is the importance of process. I think that you can go back to, I haven't thought about further back than to Vietnam. And for almost all the big mistakes that the United States has made strategically, they have some root in a failure process, right? And taking into account all the dynamics that Dennis describes in his case studies and in his kind of overview, both at the beginning and the end of the book. Importance of process. Dwight Eisenhower said, great process won't ensure you a kind of a perfect outcome, but bad process will almost always ensure you a bad outcome, right? And I think that you go through that, Dennis, and we can go through some of the examples like Vietnam or the Iraq War. You go into some detail in the book about the Iraq War and really kind of the failure process, at least at the beginning, that was kind of got corrected in the second Bush 43 term. And just two others, right? And I'll answer your questions. It's practical. Dennis is obviously a first-rate historian and academic, but he's a super practical guy, right? And if you go through the case studies here, there's a lot of focus on practical aspects of this, right? Were the decision makers tired? Did you have the right people in the room, right? Was the timing right? And those kinds of things I think are enormously insightful for people studying this. And the last thing I would say is Dennis also has what I've seen over an almost 50-year career in Washington, kind of one of the attributes that make great diplomats and negotiators, right? Which is unbelievable persistence. I think back then it's about the folks that I admired, even as a 22-year-old, Saul Linowitz, right? And Dick Holbrooke, and yourself, right? It's there's no giving up, right? There's a way into this, right? If you can just kind of stay at it, right? The circumstances can change. You can narrow or widen the aperture that you're dealing with in a particular problem. So I love all this. I love the book, and it just really does reflect, I think, some of Dennis's insights and I think these things about they're really important, I think, to the effective practice of diplomacy. So I wanted to congratulate you, Dennis, and I think those attributes really come through in every one of the chapters in the book.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. Now, on the current circumstance.
Well, I feel like that's great framing, actually. Please do jump in, because there's a certain optimism, that you described at the foundation in the art of diplomacy. So, give us that in that context.
Well, the failure to do the things that I just went through will not bring an optimistic outcome. I think it's kind of I think an important point. Now, in the current circumstance, so you asked how to describe it in kind of a short way, our current approach to foreign policy in the current administration. I think it is a disruption, right? But there is I think it's fair to say, a fundamental reworking, both geopolitically and economically, of the relationship between the United States and the rest of the world. That's what this is about right now, right? And it really is. It's a global effort, and it really is fundamental. It's the biggest change we've seen geopolitically in the world since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the disestablishment of the Soviet Union, which you're so familiar with and have written about, right? In 1989 and 1991. And it is, in terms of specific areas like U.S., Europe, it's the biggest change, I think, since World War II, right? And kind of the fundamental relationship and expectations. And you saw that in a series of really important texts. I kind of, Dennis knows I like to, go back and look at the statute first, the map, and the text of things, right? To kind of start a discussion. If you look at the text of the talks, right? I mean, the administration is quite clear on where they want to take this relationship, right, with Europe. I mean, the president's speech at Davos talked about what he saw as kind of mistreatment by the European Union for a long time. Secretary Hegseth's speech in Germany when he was meeting with the Ukraine support contact group around the United States will no longer regard Europe as a principal security issue. Vice President Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference about the politics and cultural aspects, if you will, of the relationship. And on top of that, you see the challenges Europe has. And my best list of the challenges is Mario Draghi's speech at the European Parliament on February 18th, and he building on a report that he did on the challenges that Europe has. Now, as Dennis said, some of this can it has kind of, there's a variety of outcomes you can have here, right? You know, we're seeing, and a lot of it is disruptive. Some of it we see obviously in Europe right now, which is there's been a really fast change in approach, right? Fundamental things, right? I mean, the new soon-to-be Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, coming out and basically putting on the table, kind of $500 billion worth of investments in Germany, right? In defense and infrastructure. Van der Leyen, the head of the European Commission, saying they're going to put together a kind of a very large defense thing. So there's change underway. Now, the last thing I'll say is I think it's kind of early to say what the ultimate outcomes are going to be here, because as Dennis said, you don't know it's action and reaction. What are the real goals? They're not clear all the time, right? But I think some things are clear, right? Just as kind of characteristics, not to finish on this. One, see what you think, Dennis. One is that foreign policy in this administration is quite personal to the president. And I'll try to say the following half a dozen quick points in a way that I think that if President Trump was sitting where Dennis is, he wouldn't disagree. All right. So it's quite personal, right? It is quite transactional. In many cases with kind of, lessons that kind of zero-sum outcomes. I think that's fair. The president seems to have a very high tolerance for conflict in relationships, right? There's not sharp differences drawn between allies and adversaries, right? Allies and competitors, right? It's all kind of on this kind of transactional way. Tariffs are at the center of foreign policy right now, and I think it's seen as a tool of a generalized tool of general application, right, to solve a lot of problems, right? And the administration goes back and forth on what they're trying to do with respect to each one. Sometimes it's kind of a punitive thing, or to try to force a specific outcome, like on fentanyl and a migration, right? We have with Mexico, Canada, and Colombia. Sometimes it's structural, that we're trying to get manufacturing back in the United States, or we're trying to get reciprocal trade treatment, right? Sometimes, now that we're having kind of this return to McKinley, right, which is you can raise money off it, right? It can be a substitute in some ways for taxes. So whatever it is, right? It's got a multitude of outcomes.
The most beautiful word.
Yeah, right. But it's got a multitude of things, right, that they use for it. It seems right now to be the principal foreign policy tool that the president seems to be using right now. And the last thing I'll say is that there really is kind of an instinct to dominate situations. Dominance is an important theme here, I think, too, and we can talk about that in the Western Hemisphere context.
Yeah, that's such an important list, and we can unpack it. But you mentioned, Dennis's formative experience in helping to shape the U.S. response to the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's most people know him for his work, over the last few decades on Middle East peacemaking, but that's the context in which my husband and I really, got to know you, I think, much better, is working on our biography of former Secretary of State Jim Baker, for whom you were really, the indispensable man when it came to, not only negotiating German reunification, which is one of the key case studies in this book, but I think right now, at a moment of hinge in world affairs, at a moment of, we all understand we're at a clear inflection point, moving from one kind of post-Cold War moment into something else. People have different views of, what to call the thing that we're moving into. I'm curious, you talk about some of it in the book, but your thoughts right now about the unraveling of that one order, and what are lessons that people should remember, because I think people don't remember history, or they, pick and choose, the lessons that they want to look from that.
It's interesting that what was driving President Bush and Jim Baker at the time the Berlin Wall came down was a sense that this was a moment to create Europe whole and free. President Bush had given a speech in May where he actually talked about this as a longer-term goal. And then the wall comes down, and then the preoccupation was, you're not going to you have an opportunity to create a Europe whole and free, but you cannot put Germany in a position where it's between the two blocks. And therefore, the focus needs to be on, you're going to have German unification because it's now inevitable, but we need to make sure it takes place in a certain context. And we understand it's going to be really hard for the Soviets. So our objective has to be to create a framing of the issue so NATO is changing, Europe is changing, and it's not a threat to the Soviets. And we can create a package of reassurance and even some material support to make it easier. And I raise that in answer to your question because there was an understanding. We had to work really closely with allies. We had to reassure allies. They had to be part of the package. We had to be intensively anticipating problems. And it was a reminder that you have multiple tools, but you have to orchestrate them. You have to choreograph them in a way that leaves nothing to chance. Now, you're operating in a world where a lot of things can be imposed on you, which means you can be hit at any moment by a surprise, and yet you had to be able to anticipate it or immediately basically deal with it as a result. So that's kind of point one. Point two, when Saddam Hussein's decided he's going to go and absorb Kuwait, George H.W. Bush's reaction was, we're entering a new era, and it can't be an era that's shaped by the law of the jungle. It can't be an era where bigger states can basically absorb smaller states. We're no longer in this bipolar world, but we need to define what this new world is going to look like. And I guess what I'm affected by more than anything else, especially right now, fundamental norms. Like big states don't get to absorb small states. Like aggression is something that needs to be ruled out. It's unacceptable. Like creating what the relationship between states is going to look like. None of this meant the U.S. giving up its national interests. None of it meant that we were giving up our sovereignty, but all of it understood that our interests could be served by creating a set of norms and by working effectively with our allies. One of the things I will say that makes me a little uneasy right now, President Trump treats the issue of leverage, which is fundamental to good statecraft, because the essence of leverage is you're getting others to do what you want them to do that they wouldn't otherwise do. And that includes not just adversaries, but also friends. But having friends and being able to frame issues in a way that makes it attractive to them, they add to your power. They don't subtract from your power. And soft power is actually one of the tools of statecraft. I don't see an interest in that right now, and it worries me about whether we will succeed even in the goals that President Trump is setting out. He still wants the U.S. to win. Now, he isn't building it on the same basis of a kind of world order or a liberal set of rules that maybe we viewed in the past, but he still wants the U.S. to win. And if you forsake some of the tools, like soft power, like alliances, it begins to raise questions in my mind whether he will succeed in winning. And then I have a question of, if he isn't winning, does he adjust?
Yeah, those are all the big questions. And, you frame the book, in fact, around this notion. You quote Bismarck to talk about, what happens to a country that either loses sight of its objectives or where the objectives are mismatched, with the tools deployed against them. And, I have that very much in mind, thinking about things like a trade war with our closest neighbors. You mentioned, I can hear Jim Baker's voice. In fact, when you're describing the approach to the end of the Cold War and this idea that, lots of crazy, uncontrollable things can happen, but you have to be in control of what you can be in control. And I think in many ways, for me, that's the biggest difference with what's happening right now. I am not a subscriber to the 3D chess match theory of the Trump case. Having interviewed hundreds of people who've worked with, for, and alongside him in his first term, that was very, very clear to me that when you see the opening move of the trade war here, there is not a plan for, what happens next week and next month and next year with that. I feel like that's an important level setting, because that's another thing I want to ask both of you about. Dennis, in the book, you talk about another, basically almost the foundation of statecraft is that you can't be lying to yourself and believing it. You have to have clear-eyed assessments, grounded in history, grounded in fact. And you give a number of many great examples. I think all of your case studies have examples of presidents not just Donald Trump, but every president, from Democrats to Republicans, who fundamentally are operating because they don't have the right assessment, or they don't believe the correct assessments. That was the case certainly in Vietnam. There's a great example that you have of Bill Clinton in I think it was 1994, meeting Assad, the father of the now deposed current leader of Syria, and saying, "Oh, I get this guy. I've met politicians like him in Arkansas, and you're trying gently to interpose, saying, Mr. President, sir, like, you don't know anybody like this in Arkansas, right?"
Yeah, I said to him, he said, "No, that's I know, I know this guy." And I said, "There's nobody in Arkansas who killed 10,000 people like Assad did in Hama. He's not the same guy." And what you're getting at is, I sort of draw this distinction. We need fact-based assessments, not faith-based assessments, not ideologically driven assessments. And we fall victim frequently to that. One of the reasons we don't marry objectives and means is usually or frequently we don't pick the right objective. And to pick the right objective, sometimes it's stakes that define it. Like in the case of German unification, or even in the first Gulf War, the stakes were seen as so high that by definition that means we were going to use all the means that we could marshal on our own and what we could mobilize from others. Sometimes it has to be feasibility. Sometimes you have to understand what you're getting into, and that you don't have the means to be able to achieve that. And if you don't have fact-based assessments, you're going to end up with a problem. The distinction I draw between the first term of Bush on going into Iraq and the second term with the surge is it's like night and day, because apropos of what you were saying, there was no process in getting into the war. There was no debate on the pros and cons. And the lack of any questioning was profound. And those who did raise questions were then excluded. Now, the interesting thing is in the second term, who's the one who drives all the hard questioning? It's Bush himself. Condoleezza Rice says it at one point when she's asked the difference between 2003 and 2007, she says, George Bush. He learns. And he has a national security advisor at that point who he empowers, who creates a very systematic structure of review. All the things that didn't exist in the first term, but they do in the second. And they're built around people around him also raising questions and then doing really hard-headed assessments. So yes, you have to understand what you're doing, and you have to understand the implications of what you're doing. And again, right now with the Trump administration, look, to be fair, we're 7 weeks into it. We'll have to see.
6, and not that we're counting.
Right. Okay. We'll have to see. Do they learn? Does he learn?
Tom, this is one of the key factors that Dennis isolates in the book, which is this idea of the president as a factor in and of itself. And presidents always have a very high view of themselves. You mentioned that that's one of the hallmarks of Trump's foreign policy, is a strong belief in his own views. Tell us what kind of risks you see inherent in that right now, or where are the areas as you look down your list where we might not be having a reality-based assessment of some of the challenges we're taking on?
Well, Dennis's point about kind of fact-based versus faith-based is fundamental, right? And again, you can go back through these historical examples, and there's exactly right. When I came into office and this National Security Council. That it? You got it?
Yes.
Okay, great. When I came into the National Security Council in 2009, Dennis and I were working together. Then it took me a little while to get him from the State Department over to the National Security Council, but we ultimately got that done, right? But they, I couldn't. I did a pretty intensive deep dive into Iraq, and how, again, trying to understand what happened. How did we get here, right? Because we obviously we still had over 100,000 troops, obviously, in Iraq when we came into office, and you can't find the meeting. You can't find the meeting where you had kind of a sit down with the president, right, and with the pros and cons of what the country was about to do, with a kind of a systematic consideration and decision making. And that's because I don't think the meeting happened.
Right.
Right. So
Yeah,
that's
no, that was certainly Peter's conclusion in Days of Fire, where
Yeah.
he interviewed all of the Bush people about that. And I
Yeah.
think it's always something that we
Yeah.
we cite about.
Yeah.
that
And
we-
that goes to two things, right? It goes to process we talk about. It also goes to people. And picking people for these positions are you're not just picking staff. You're picking people on whom you can rely to bring judgment, who have some independent stature and are willing to kind of tell you the truth. And that's part of a good process. Right? And that certainly is, we'll see. Again, we're early on here, right? We'll see. But the President Trump does have a very high degree of confidence in himself. And he says that in a number of interviews, that he basically at the end of the day relies on himself, that who's your chief advisor? Well, I'm my chief advisor. Well, having a good process in order to avoid the kinds of mistakes that we could go through the last half century, it's important to have the right people and the right process. The second thing is that the fundamentals matter in these things, so having a goal that is achievable and clear, right, is pretty critical. And when some of the mistakes that I certainly made in some of our projects over the years, right, was not insisting on kind of a really kind of a precise, right? And you use precision as one of your important dynamics, right?
Yeah.
To having kind of a precise understanding of what you're trying to do, what the United States is trying to do in a specific thing. And I hope this administration does get kind of precise about things. The other thing is that with respect to the world, given the leadership position the United States has, that producing a lot of uncertainty doesn't work in anybody's interest. I think at the end of the day, and there's a high level of uncertainty around a lot of things right now. It's important to kind of get to some more certainty. You see that in the markets right now. There's a kind of a degree of uncertainty as to in which direction, what priorities is the administration going to pursue, and kind of getting your arms around that certainty, which sends cues to the world as to how they're going to act and react. Is pretty important fundamentally, don't you think? That you have to kind of and you need to do it you have to force yourself to do this with some precision. And it's easy not to do it with precision, by the way, because you go into a meeting, you've got a lot of people there, the president has a view, everybody has a view, and you say, well, this is kind of what we're trying to do. And your process has to say that's not good enough, because we've seen, and again, arguably, maybe the biggest mistake the United States has made in a half century, right, was the Iraq War strategically, and it was a failure to be precise and have a deep understanding of what we were getting ourselves into.
The other thing that springs to mind when you're talking about this, and I'm sure you're probably going to bring it up, is Israel before October 7th, and kind of the unexamined policy that should have been a lot more thought through, which was, are your assumptions about Gaza correct? Are your assumptions about Hamas correct?
Look, you get mindsets. Groupthink, which I sort of go over in a number of different cases, is the most destructive thing to good statecraft, because groupthink by definition means you will exclude certain inputs, you will exclude certain kinds of assumptions. We've had it on a number of cases. The Israelis clearly had it prior to October 7th. Anytime you suffer strategic surprise, it's never a function of lacking information. Everything that you needed to know to avoid the surprise was available, but a prism is created by the groupthink and everything you interpret through that prism. So in the case of the Israelis, absolutely, there was a groupthink, what they call a conceptia. Now, even after that, one of the reasons oftentimes we end up picking the wrong objective, and it's because we don't understand the situation, or we have a set of political pressures. Prime Minister Netanyahu established very quickly total victory as his objective. And this gets to the point you were raising about lack of precision. Total victory is a slogan. It's not an objective. You have to break it down. Well, what does it mean? What should have happened at that time were specific questions. How much of Hamas do we have to destroy? How much of its military infrastructure? How much of the tunnels? What do we need to achieve in terms of their weakening to then be able to create, not on our own, but with others, an alternative to them? Because you can talk about eradicating Hamas, and that's an ideology you won't succeed. You can talk about as a certain level of defeat. But if you don't have an alternative, then you leave a vacuum in which they can come back, or you're stuck there forever. So you can have a set of political pressures which help to explain why you don't have the right objective. I also show in a number of cases that, in fact, political pressures lead to presidents to adopt certain objectives, and those objectives are either disconnected from reality or that it's such a high level of generality that you can't operationalize them. I actually conclude in the book one of the things that I didn't personally think before. I didn't think you could do statecraft in a more mechanical way, but I do think you actually need a checklist of specific questions that you discuss in these high-level meetings where you say, okay, what is our objective? Let's be specific about what we're talking about. It is really hard, and that's what you were describing, Tom. It's really hard to get people to address with a high degree of specificity, okay, what is it that is really important to us to achieve?
Tom, I see you nodding your head a lot here. What is your view of the kind of, was it an original sin after October 7th to not define victory more clearly for the Israelis?
Well, first of all, obviously there was a lot of, and it's been now documented in Israel right now, a lot of failures on the lead up, right, in terms of understanding what the dynamic was, what the threat was, what was being planned, and there was a significant failure. I think I don't think it's arguable at this point that it's a significant failure. Point one. Point two is that outcomes are also in a situation like this have to be multidimensional too. So if you're able to degrade the military aspects of Hamas to a degree that no longer poses kind of a serious threat to Israel proper, what's next? And that, I think, has been really one of the significant failures here, right? Which is this multidimensional thing. What's next in terms of humanitarian assistance? What's next in terms of reconstruction? What's next in terms of governance? What's next in terms of security, right? And that's not, I don't think that thinking hasn't been done at anywhere near the level of depth. I think, Dennis, that it needs to be done at this point. And it was almost like a refusal to do it while the military aspects of the operation were underway. You can't just wish away, right, the later pieces of this on humanitarian and on reconstruction, and really importantly on governance and on security. Otherwise, you will be in a military posture forever if you don't do the other pieces of this. We certainly learned that in Iraq and in other places as well. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I wanted to, again, just put it in a political context. It was understandable, given the shock and the trauma of October 7th, that you're also trying to reassure your own people. And one way you try to do that is you talk about total victory. But it's a reminder. It is, on the one hand, you have to reassure your public. You have to be able to address your public if you're going to sustain a policy. On the other, you have to have a policy that also can produce an outcome that you can achieve, because rather than reassuring your public, you're going to end up raising further questions. And that, I think, is a lot of what's going on right now in Israel, that you have people who on the one hand say, look, maybe the most important objective we have right now is getting the remaining hostages who are alive out, and dealing with if it means we agree and we implement the three-phased approach to ceasefire and hostages, we'll do that. And the military is basically saying, let's do that. And we know who Hamas is, that by definition, they will go ahead and they violate, and you can always then go back and deal with them. And you'll have political support to do that. So the question I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu faces right now is, there's a strategic imperative not to live with Hamas next door, able to reconstitute itself, which everybody accepts. There's a political imperative that if he resumes the war too soon, he risks the lives of the hostages who remain alive, and he will face a reaction from the public, who have now put as the first priority, let's get the hostages out. And how does, even if you resume the war, how does that relate to you being able to produce an alternative to Hamas? Because if you don't produce an alternative to Hamas, even if it's not Israel that produces it, but it creates a context, you are either in a position where you're stuck in Gaza forever because you'll face an insurgency, or without an alternative, Hamas will come back, even if it takes a long time.
You know, it's interesting. The no group is more worthy of destruction, right, than Hamas. But it has to be a multidimensional long-term effort, right? You know, otherwise you will just be in kind of this constant action and reaction military cycle. And we may be, I don't know what you think, Dennis, we may be, given that the administration's put forth ideas, obviously, as you said, and the Arab states have put forth ideas after meeting in Cairo, was it, I guess, in the last week or so. It may be set up to have kind of a multilateral discussion about what a multidimensional plan post Hamas looks like. Do you think that's a fair? It may be. We may be. We may kind of have forced this discussion right to a point where it may be useful to start to sit down and talk about with kind of a number of nations what the next steps are.
I agree. I actually, again, I sort of come back to the logic of statecraft. What's the objective? The objective for Gaza should be reconstruction for demilitarization. Okay, that should be the objective. So what are the means we have to get to that objective? And here it basically does involve a multilateral approach heavily with the Arabs. We know there's at least one Arab party that's quite serious about being prepared even to go and be part of a stabilization force. It's the UAE. The UAE has also made it clear if Hamas remains in control, we're not investing. So there is something to work with there. The Saudis are also, they're not going to invest in Gaza if Hamas is still there and they can reconstitute themselves, because if they can reconstitute themselves, they'll do this again. And no one is going to say, well, why would we spend all that money and just to set them up so they can destroy it again? So there is a basis, I think, on which to get there. The question is, I think, who is going to orchestrate that? Who's going to choreograph these steps? This is a classic example where there's a lot of different pieces you have to be able to fit together. This is a good test case for statecraft.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I want to ask both of you about another, the big test case right now outside of the Middle East is in Europe. And I was really struck. Dennis begins the book, with Vladimir Putin, actually, not, any American president, but you actually start the book and you talk about what appeared to be the case even just a few months ago. And I want to ask both of you whether you think that's still the case. And you said that, Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine was a clear miscalculation. And, certainly in a narrow sense, nobody can disagree. He thought he was going to take Kyiv in a matter of days, and that it was going to, but also you said it would result in the rewriting of European security on terms favorable to Putin, and that was a mistake. Look at the costs to his own society, to his economy, the enormity of the losses of men is extraordinary, actually, in this conflict. But here we are just a few months later, and there's a very interesting prospect of it actually potentially not being a long-term defeat for Russia, largely because of what's happened here in the United States of America. And I'm struck again and again the practical imperatives that you outline and that you and Tom are the premier practitioners of in many ways over the last few decades in American foreign policy. But how here in Washington, we shy away from big things. We shy away from things that are unthinkable. You cite a book by someone in 2005, essentially saying, there's no possibility of great power competition anymore. So we should just focus on, rewriting the world order. That book, it's a good reminder to me to go look for that book. It was unthinkable, even to you, writing this book just a few months ago, that the United States might hand Vladimir Putin a strategic victory out of the ashes of what seemed to be certain strategic defeat. So how do we assess that right now? And am I right? Do both you agree that Putin could actually end up being the winner in some ways, in some strategic way, out of this horrible war?
I think it's not going to be easy for him to become a strategic winner. You made a reference, 700,000 dead and wounded, interest rates running at 21%, inflation double digits, huge brain drain out of Russia. He's relying on North Koreans. You have to draw on them for people on the ground. Drawing on this great superpower has to draw on Iran for drones and cruise missiles. So it's true, I think, that he has been set back in a significant way. What you're raising is President Trump's objective of ending the war? Is that objective and his means for doing it, does it rely on basically coercing Ukraine to give in to what Putin wants? And he clearly has leverage, for sure. But I would also say, in the end, the Ukrainians are not going to commit suicide, and he can't impose that on them. And Putin isn't in such a great place that he can achieve through the use of force what he wants. And here I would say I'd get back to, I think with President Trump, as I said, one of the ways to talk about objectives with him is, look, if you do not want to be seen as losing, if Ukraine loses its sovereignty, by the way, you won't have favorable access to rare earth minerals, and you will be seen as losing. So I think at some point he will have to come to grips with the fact that the ability to exert leverage has to be on Putin as well. And we haven't seen it. Maybe there's something behind the scenes that we're not seeing. And he's very public on his leverage on Zelensky, and so far very private on his leverage with Putin. But he has real leverage on Putin, because he can say, look, Vladimir, I'm your friend, but I got to say, if there aren't, for example, you want to solve the issue of territory, let's agree that we'll have referendum in Crimea and in the Donbass. And whatever the outcome of the referendum, if you're so confident about it, you should be able to accept that as a way of resolving the territory. And if you're not prepared to do that, then then we're prepared to continue to support Ukraine. I mean, that would be a way for him to exercise leverage and still be trying to end the war.
The United States is in a position now, and you listen to the National Security Advisor and others, that we're in a position right now to start to go back and forth between the parties. And I think it's a good and appropriate role for the United States, point one. Point two is, though, we really should have a keen appreciation for the leverage that we have over the Russians at this point. And also to have a keen appreciation of what Putin's ultimate goals are. That is an important piece of this dynamic. We have been Russia's been basically actively hostile to the United States since Putin came back into office, 2012, 2013. I saw him the Friday night before he was inaugurated into his second term in Moscow, and it was very clear that he was going to take a very different direction for Russia and reassert its position, in his view, right? And it's kind of a much more aggressive position in the world. And we saw, and we can go through the whole list, as you know very well, the whole list of actively hostile steps that Russia has taken against the United States and the West, up to and including invading Ukraine, but also engaging in a very aggressive shadow war in Europe right now. So understanding his ultimate goals here is a pretty important piece of this going into this project, right? The United States is taking on, because it's obviously a positive in the war, and we have a role to play and a special role to play. But I think those two things are really important, right? We have to much more appreciate the leverage that we have. If you look back at kind of the perspective of the beginning of the war, there was a defeat for the Russian army. Obviously, they thought they would be able to end the war quite quickly, right, and take over Kiev and decapitate the government there and take over the country. That didn't happen. They have a neighbor now, right, in Ukraine, which is much more capable militarily than it ever was, much closer to the West than it ever had been prior to the invasion. NATO now has I don't know what the number of miles, maybe 800 additional more miles, kind of on the border with Russia. And as Dennis was going through, the Russian economy over the long term, right, is not in a very positive position. So there's a lot of leverage, but it's also, Susan, I think you got to understand. It goes to the point. It goes to the question you asked Dennis about, the elder Assad, right? And President Clinton's comments about I've dealt with guys like this, right? No, you haven't, right? This is and it also goes to my earlier point about history. History matters a lot. The psychology of these guys matters a lot. You have to understand their goals and understand that this is not just some commercial transaction, right? This is freighted with a lot of additional dynamics that's absolutely essential to understand when you sit down with these guys. Is that fair, do you think?
Yeah, that history of the last 2 decades with Putin, of course, is, one that I'm very interested in understanding, because it's presidents in both parties who at various steps along the way either underestimated Putin or misread what he was after. Both of you saw that at firsthand. Both the Bush and Obama administration, you could say at key moments, underestimated him. But I want to, before we go back to the bigger picture, I want to actually poke both of you just a tiny bit, because I really want to know what you think, not because I know the answer. Both of you are saying we have a lot of leverage on Russia and Putin right now, and you're wondering whether Trump is going to use it. Do you both rule out the idea that President Trump actually doesn't want to use it, or, is actually changing sides? Is it possible that the United States of America is experiencing a president who wants to shift our grand strategy?
I think it's pretty clear he does want to shift our grand strategy. He wants to build it, I think, less around alliance systems. I said earlier, one of the things that does concern me is the lack of appreciation that allies actually add to your power. President Trump tends to look at allies as they obligate us. They're not spending enough on defense. Why should we have to do these things? Now, the irony is they are now, and you said it earlier about Germany, it's not just that they're committing a huge amount to infrastructure spending, they're also committing much more to defense. All of Europe is doing that. They're about to relax the debt rules they've had, which is quite remarkable. Here again, I would say President Trump can claim victory. He can say, this would not have happened without what I'm doing. And by the way, there's some truth to that. But then the question becomes, okay, was this all a ploy? Or was it part of something fundamentally different? If it was part of a ploy, he will be able to show over time he changed the burden sharing in a way that others didn't succeed in doing over years. I'm hoping, and I'm hoping this isn't wishful thinking, I'm hoping that this is more ploy than anything else. I worry that it does reflect a fundamental view that we can deal with allies and adversaries as being the same. And I think that will sooner or later, he will find that will not succeed. And this is a president who's built entirely around the concept of winning.
It's interesting. So a couple of things. First of all, I do think that the president wants to fundamentally change the relationship between the United States and Russia. He said that, right? Point one. Point two, it's too narrow, and it's too kind of unidimensional. And by that, what I mean is this: if you look at the global challenges the United States has, we're in a kind of a very different phase in history, right? If you look at the pace of change in just the last 7 or 8 years, really since and the repeated shocks to the system, from the trade wars to COVID to inflation to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's been a lot of shocks to the system, and it's resulted in upset in the international system, also upset among societies, right, and domestically. The fragmentation. Second, there's now way diminished cooperation between and among the great powers, right? You think about it, Dennis. There was I think, I don't know. You and Peter are working on this book that it wasn't might have been right up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine that were actually kind of liaison work being done at the NATO headquarters, right, with Russians, right? I think back in the great financial crisis, right, beginning in 2009, there was the G20 meeting in London in April 2009, right, where think about this, that wasn't that long ago. The table was, being chaired by Gordon Brown, who was then our Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and at the table were a number of Europeans, but also Hu Jintao, the president of China, right, the general secretary of the Communist Party of China, Dmitry Medvedev, the president of Russia, and Barack Obama, the newly elected president of the United States, working on a joint program, right, to try to support the global economy. That meeting would not take place today on any topic.
Yeah, and Russia was a key, partner in negotiating the JCPOA with Iran.
That's exactly right. So think about how fast this is, how fast that this has changed, right, in terms of the geopolitics of the situation. There are blocks building out. But the point I was going to get to, well, I think this is, and I would encourage the administration to think more globally about this. The principal competitor the United States has in the world today is China. And that is, and that's kind of our principal economic competitor and our principal security competitor in the world. And for that to be successfully taken on, it can't just be one-dimensional around tariffs and economics, right? There's a multi-dimensional set of things, obviously, we have to deal with, including security and competition in the third world and the global south, ideological competition, all manner of things, right? So it has to be multidimensional. And secondly, it has to be multilateral. If you look at kind of the challenge that we have, we can prevail and meet the challenge and do well, right? Going forward here on technology and economics and security, only if we act as a coalition. Now this is the most important insight, right? That basically that in order to succeed with a number of our goals in terms of our respect to China, where we are in competition and hope to prevail, as do they, hope to prevail, we have a much, much better chance of prevailing if you actually sit down, for example, and do the manufacturing capability of China, which today, by the way, as a country, it has a greater manufacturing capacity in terms of the percentage of global manufacturing capacity that any country has had since the United States after World War II, right? But that is matchable ultimately. And of course, and if there were, God forbid, a conflict, which both sides should work hard to avoid, obviously, and if there were a conflict, that manufacturing capability matters a lot in a protracted conflict, right? It matters a lot generally. So we need to be able to kind of meet that challenge as a member, as a leader of a coalition. So if you set about shrinking that coalition, right, it really does, I think, diminish the ability of the United States to prevail in what is really the real contest.
I'm so glad you brought it back to China, and we could have a whole next conversation, which I would love to have about the two of you and brainstorming around that, and especially the question of whether pushing away your partners in the European Union and Canada and Mexico is the right approach. If you're correct that China is the long-term threat. Dennis, this has been an amazing conversation. Really, we could have like 3 more hours on this, but is there anything here that surprised you as we finish up in going back and looking at the book, looking at your own experience? What is it that we're all missing right now?
I'll tell you what actually surprised me, because I did a book basically almost 20 years ago, and because the world changed so dramatically, I decided I had to do a new one. I didn't appreciate, even though I always talked about the marriage of objectives and means, I myself didn't fully think through why so often we pick the wrong objective. It didn't hit me until I went through an additional number of cases on Republican and Democratic presidents alike. And I saw, look, when I started with Iraq, I could see, okay, it was ideologically driven. But then the more I looked at it, I thought, you know what? Political pressures produce objectives without thinking through. We change objectives midstream. Sometimes we're more successful than we thought, and suddenly what's known as mission creep, we redefine the objective, but it doesn't fit the circumstances. This notion of defining objectives at way too high a level of generality, that's what also led me to say, all right, let's create more of a systematic set of questions that you have to ask about your objectives before you adopt one. That was a surprise to me. And it's interesting, when I wrote the first book 19 years ago, wasn't a part of it. So yes, it gets back to your point about history. The more you go back and review these kinds of cases systematically, you learn lessons. And there's a variety of lessons that I learn and I talk about. By the way, one interesting lesson is that you really do need strong presidential leadership. It's not a guarantee of success, because if the president adopts the wrong mindset or goes off on the wrong path, you're not going to succeed, obviously. But one of the things that is consistent in all the good cases of statecraft, you create whole of government efforts. And it takes presidential leadership to ensure you get the whole of government effort, meaning every instrumentality we have with all the different agencies, they work together. Just one last point on this, George W. Bush, during the period of the surge and afterwards, he does these daily calls with Petraeus and Ryan Crocker, and he's asking them, what is it that you need? And they would give him an answer, and then Steve Hadley would make sure that, and this was the whole of government, would work to respond to it. So you can't always have the president show that much attention, but the point is, a president who sends a message that we're going to create a whole of government effort is a sine qua non for successful statecraft.
That's a good and important note to end it on. We'll see.
I have one other note.
Okay, one more note.
If you're a student at Georgetown, you should take Dennis's class.
Clearly, maybe you can put it online for the rest of us too. And I was going to say,
I'd like to take Dennis's class.
Yeah, me too. I'm in, and maybe you guys can go and have a nice briefing session with the current national security advisor. I know that he would benefit from a lot of insights in this book and from the history. And for the rest of you, it's Statecraft 2.0. What America needs to lead in a multipolar world. Thank you so much to Tom Donilon and Dennis Ross. This has really been a fantastic, I think, an important conversation.
Well, thanks to you both. I really appreciate it.